Hello and welcome to the fourth of 6 webinars in the Frequently Asked Practice Query series. This video will be focused on questions around informed consent. If you have not already done so, I invite you to watch the introductory video in this series. It'll help you make sense of the information and perspectives offered in this and future webinars. I'm Judith Pinto, Occupational Therapist and Practice Advisor with the Alberta College of Occupational Therapists. I am recording this session today in Edmonton, Alberta. Situated on the North Saskatchewan River, this land has been home to many Indigenous communities, primarily the Cree, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and Métis for thousands of years. Edmonton is located in Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. The image on the screen is of the Rossdale Cemetery. It's a memorial that was built to remember the traditional burial grounds that were located on the Rossdale Flats. Part of the Epcor power plant site, this land was set aside when remains were discovered. The City of Edmonton, Epcor, descendants of traditional bands of the area, and other community members came together to design and create this memorial. It was opened on August 2006 and remains a site that is protected by law. So let's begin with a shared understanding of our definition of informed consent. Informed consent is essentially an agreement or permission to proceed with a service following a process of information exchange and confirmation of mutual understanding, leading to an informed choice. In order to be valid, the client or substitute decision maker must have the capacity to give consent. The consent must also be given voluntarily and be specific to the proposed service and service provider. The consent provided may be explicit or implied from the circumstances and should be sought on an ongoing basis. So in step 1, we're going to get clear about the question. I work with children in schools and have a referral that has been signed by the parent. Does that mean I have consent to proceed with OT services? So once we're clear on the question, we can triage from an ACOT perspective and decide whether this fits within ACOT's mandate. Given that ACOT's mandate is to ensure safe and effective occupational therapy services to Albertans, consent is definitely part of that. So we will proceed to step 2. In step 2, we want to look at hunches. The caller, usually the registrant, is calling for a reason. They have a sense that maybe that isn't informed consent, or maybe it is, but something's niggling at them. So I'd like to know what their hunch is. But before we proceed, I'm going to suggest that you pause the video and think about that question. Does that signed referral form constitute informed consent? So the questions you might need to ask is it okay to begin to see the child with this written proof that the parent knows that you're seeing them? And is that the same thing as informed consent? Often there's a dilemma between kind of needing to be expedient in meeting the needs of the referral source or your employer versus demonstrating full respect for the autonomy of the client or whomever has the capacity to offer consent. So what do you think is the right thing to do? Let's step in to step 3. In Alberta, informed consent is based on common law, also known as judicial precedent, judge-made law, or case law, rather than statutory law or laws that are passed by federal, provincial, or territorial legislatures. Based on societal values and community expectations, common law develops through precedents that are established through decisions judges have made in previous cases, provincially or federally. Suffice it to say, yes, healthcare providers are required to obtain informed consent as defined by the standards of practice. In our example, while the referral form with a signature may be documentation of consent, in and of itself it is not proof of informed consent, unless that document was the endpoint of a process in which the individual or individuals who have the capacity to offer consent, the parents or children, were informed about the nature, risks, benefits, and alternatives of the services offered, who was providing those services, and any opportunity, and were given the opportunity to have questions they may have answered. Then that document may reflect documentation of informed consent. But without that exchange of information, that piece of paper may simply be a referral. In step 4, we look at the regulations. Let's turn to ACOT's Standard of Practice on Informed Consent, and I'm going to recommend that I don't read it to you. I recommend that you read it for yourself and take a look at it in your context and how that might apply. We'll also, however, briefly look at the Code of Ethics on Responsibilities to Client, B4. Registrants have an ethical responsibility to respect and support a client's autonomy to choose whether to proceed with, decline, or stop occupational therapy services, including in situations when a client does not have capacity to provide informed consent. So that might be a child who, while they cannot provide informed consent, can certainly assent. They can say yes or no. They're not going to do something. Code of Ethics B5, a registrant has a responsibility to respect a client's autonomy to determine their own tolerance for risk in service provision. And finally, the practice guidelines on informed consent would also be really good for you to review and have that be available if you're going to call in on an informed consent conversation, to have that in your pocket so that you have some sense of what we might be discussing. In our example, the referral document was signed by the parent with other forms at the start of the school year. The therapist was not available, and the individual who was providing the forms to the parent was not able to answer questions about the nature of occupational therapy services, let alone the risks, benefits, and alternatives for the service being proposed and who was providing that service. So in that case, this document would not have been proof of informed consent and would not meet minimum expectations as defined in the Standard of Practice on Informed Consent or as described in the Practice Guideline on Informed Consent. Most employers have policies in place around consent. It would be important for registrants to ensure that they're aware of their employer policies and ensure that they meet or exceed ACOT's minimum expectations as per ACOT Standard of Practice on Informed Consent. If they are in private practice, they will need to establish policies and procedures that likewise meet or exceed ACOT's minimum expectations. In our example, the employer, a school board, may not have a fulsome understanding of the obligations of healthcare staff, people who are regulated health professionals, and therefore may not know that simply signing a document may not constitute informed consent. While the process may fit within the school board's policies and procedures to obtain consent for other activities, field trips or in-school activities, it would not meet minimum expectations as per ACOT standards. So the therapist would need to ensure that the parent who signed the form is fully informed before initiating any services. Ideally, the referral provides the therapist with the parent's contact information so they can reach out to work collaboratively with them. They may need to establish limits on what they can work on. For instance, a school-based occupational therapist may not be permitted by their employer to address issues that are not based on a child's functioning at school. However, a collaborative approach, as per Canadian OT competencies, is still needed. In step 6, we'll do an ethical check. As per Code of Ethics B4 and B5 that were discussed earlier, there are ethical considerations that need to be addressed. Asking and obtaining permission before providing a health service is always expected. Ongoing confirmation for consent, knowing full well that a client has the option to withdraw consent at any time, is also an expectation. At this point in step 7, a registrant may have arrived at a preliminary decision based on the legislation, regulations, ethical discussions, and perhaps have a sense of what they need for next steps. In our example, the therapist recognizes that the document they have is actually a signed referral, and not informed consent or evidence of informed consent. The therapist recognizes that they may need to take some more steps before they can begin to offer services to the child. Which takes us to step 8. And steps 8 to 10 are really things that the therapist will need to consider independently. Therapists will know their context. Is their situation unique in some way? Are there factors that require some accommodation? Is it difficult to reach parents during regular school hours? Is it difficult for parents to access email or other technologies for communication that are secure? Are they grappling with the expectation from the school to begin seeing clients as soon as possible due to time pressures? And while all of those factors may be important considerations and may play a role in the therapist making the decision, ideally, the therapist needs to layer those in and on top of the minimum expectations as outlined in the standards of practice on informed consent. In step 9, if a therapist is still not sure, they need to get more information. That could be from legal counsel and ethical consultation, clinical supervisors, managers, professional practice leads, peer consultation, or a mentor. Ideally, a therapist needs to come to a decision that they understand and can justify and then document as to why they're proceeding the way they are. And finally, in step 10, the therapist needs to come to a final decision and explore whether the needs and perspectives of all parties have been addressed, and if there are limitations or consequences that may create difficulties, if there are some strategies to minimize their impact, particularly putting the best interest of the client first. And ideally, they are confident in the decision that they've arrived at. That would be reflected in their understanding of why they have made the choice they have. And if they need to do anything to make sure that future decision points are easier, that they have a plan in place, possibly to adjust their own procedures or to adjust policies within the organization. So thank you for attending today's session. I hope you found this a useful discussion on informed consent. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out by email or phone.